Hello and welcome. I'm Ijoma Onyato. Tonight, Zimbabweans jubilate as Robert Mugabe resigns as the country's president after several days of defiance in a face-off with the military. Suicide bombing in a mosque in Mugabe, Adamawa State, leaves at least 21 people dead. President Buhari condemns attack, describes it as dastardly. Central Bank of Nigeria leaves all rates unchanged at its Monetary Policy Committee meeting in Abuja on the strength of its interventions in the foreign exchange market. And suicide car bomb attack in Iraq kills at least 23 people in a crowded fruit and vegetable market in Baghdad. And on business news tonight, President of African Development Bank highlights challenges and solutions to address operations in Africa's aviation sector.
On sports news tonight, Romelu Lukaku avoids going to jail to compensate the U.S. police for noise pollution.
And from Abuja, operatives of the National Intelligence Agency and the Department of State Services thwart EFCC's attempts to nab their former bosses.
We begin tonight from Zimbabwe, where Zimbabweans have been celebrating the resignation of long-term leader Robert Mugabe. Celebrations rent the air in the capital Harare shortly after the Speaker of Parliament said he had received the 93-year-old's resignation. The African Union, which had called for a peaceful resolution of the crisis, says it's delighted that the former president agreed to resign. The ZANU-PF says sacked Vice President Emerson Mnangagwa, when he is sworn in a couple of days, will serve out Mugabe's term till 2018. Our Foreign Affairs correspondent Amarachi Ubani reports.
After nearly 4 decades of rule by a man who turned from independence hero to African strongman, Robert Mugabe finally steps down, and Zimbabweans could not be happier. Wild celebrations broke out at a joint sitting of Parliament when Speaker Jacob Mudenda read out Mugabe's resignation and suspended the impeachment procedure.
I, Robert W. Mugabe, in terms of Section 96, Subsection 1 of the Constitution of Zimbabwe, hereby formally tender my resignation as the President of the Republic of Zimbabwe with immediate effect.
Out on the streets of Harare, people cheered, danced and shook hands with members of the armed forces. While Parliament prepared for impeachment proceedings, calls increased for Mugabe to step down. From the War Veterans Association to leader of the main opposition, the Women for Democratic Change, Morgan Changirai, and from the country's youth who had waited outside the parliamentary building as lawmakers prepared to deliberate.
You have ruled for 37 years. We don't want you another 37 seconds. Please. Go away, go, Mugabe, go.
Now, the question is, how do we end Mugabe?
News of Mugabe's resignation filtered throughout the rest of the world. UK Prime Minister Theresa May said Mugabe's resignation was an opportunity to forge a new path free of the oppression that characterized his rule. The US Embassy called the resignation historic, saying it is an opportunity for the nation to set itself on a new path that will lead to free and fair elections. Amarachi Ubani, Channel Television News.
Get a little bit of a feel of what's happening in Zimbabwe at the moment. Let's get that perspective from a policy and international affairs analyst, Mr. Sam Amadi. Thank you so much for joining us on the news at 10.
Thank you very much.
All right, what do you think was the trigger for Mr. Mugabe's resignation today? I mean, this is something that he could have done days ago. The whole world was expecting him to do so. What do you think was the trigger?
Well, when you're a great man, a superman, you don't seem to, you miss out on clear signs. Mugabe should have known before now that he was losing control of the party. He should have known before now that his time was really up. But of course, typical of great men of history, he missed out all those. So what triggered this move now is a clear sign that the party, the parliament would impeach him. The procedure is very clear. It wouldn't run up to 2-3 days. They will simply have to vote and then put a committee of about 9 persons, and that committee will definitely come up with a resolution to impeach him, and the 2 houses will vote to get him, impeached. And that will be very, very, it will be a hostile takeover for him. It will mean that the new government would also not treat him with the kind of respect that I've given him, at least in the last 6 days. So Mugabe, in spite of his, you can say, big pig-headedness, in spite of being a big man of history, in spite of being insensitive to all the signs that he has to quit, at some point, to his credit, he knew he had to play the last card, which was to resign, and perhaps also help Mugabe to see this as a constitutional transfer of power instead of a military coup that could trigger some other reaction. So it came to a point where he just had to, listen to common sense and did the best thing for himself, basically avoid a very stupid ouster through impeachment.
Now, one thing that we did notice today was the jubilation on the streets, and so many of them were happy. At what point do you think a leader should know that it's time up, it's time to go? You see that a lot in Africa, even at the point where the people are saying, we do not want you to be there, and they remain. So, I mean, what do you think it should be?
That's an interesting question. You see, one of the traps of great leadership is that especially revolutionary leaders who have been part of history, of liberating their country, is a sense in which you fuse yourself with the country. If you listen to Mugabe had a sense that he was there to underwrite and safeguard African ownership of Zimbabwe. He was in prison for about 4 or 5 years. He left, he was a guerrilla fighter, he won independence, he supervised, he resisted and defeated all forms of Western attempt at getting out of power. At a point, you assume you're a superhuman, that's number one. 2, you begin to see the history of your country from your own perspective. So some kind of blindness, and that's what has happened. It happens many times, especially in Africa, and that's why it's not a function of you're a bad man, it's a function of efficient. You become the state, like Napoleon once said. You become the state, and once you become the state, it's difficult to see there's a time to leave power. So it's a tragic flaw of great men of history, and the only way it's corrected is when the people themselves do not deify. The people themselves make a demand that you are great, but you just have to exit. So it's a fatal flaw of all great people of history, especially revolutionaries who have struggled, who have paid the price, imprisoned, suffered, shed blood for their country. Somehow they think that they are exactly, approximate to their country. Their country becomes their own alter ego, and then they find it difficult to pull back and allow the country to transition beyond them. Mandela is perhaps an exception to that rule, but essentially you see it across all revolutionary struggles, whether in Cuba, whether in Africa or elsewhere.
All right, international affairs analyst Mr. Sam Ahmadi, thanks for sharing your thoughts with us on the news at 10 tonight. But let's get a feel of what's happening in Zimbabwe right now. And joining me is a Zimbabwean journalist, Mr. Nigel Nyatumbutu. He's in Harare. Hi, Nigel.
Yes, hi, how are you doing?
I'm good, and we did see pictures of jubilation there. Can you just tell us if you know what the terms of Mr. Mugabe's settlement or terms of his resignation are? We do know he was in negotiations talking about his assets and talking about where he's going to live. Did you know any of that?
Well, it's very much still an ongoing negotiation. The only thing that he managed to secure, for at least for now, is that he gets a decent, assurance and a decent package for him to leave office. He needed, number one, to ensure the security of himself and his family. He also need to ensure that he will not be prosecuted in Zimbabwe and within the international court. And there is that relative assurance of that from both the military and the political party faction that really pushed for his ouster in Parliament and within his own ruling party. And it's also something that SADC is going to be very seized with when President Jacob Zuma is going to be coming to tomorrow. And it's still quite an issue for SADC to ensure a smooth transition of power in Zimbabwe.
Okay, Nigel, we understand that the ZANU-PF says the vice president, that's Ngangwa, will be sworn in tomorrow or so. Is that what the constitution says? Remember that he was sort of removed before this military takeover. Or is that just an issue because the situation is what we have now?
Well, I think we are not going to be discussing much of the constitution in Zimbabwe at the moment, because if it were going to be sticking to the legal or the law, then Vice President Pelekezela Mpoko, who is the only Vice President at the moment, in light of the resignation of President Robert Mugabe, would have been the one to have been taking over in an albeit in an interim basis, only to facilitate free and fair elections, because the Zimbabwean constitution actually has what we call sunset clauses, which would only have started operating in 10 years, and we adopted the constitution in 2013. But to be honest, that is now neither here nor there. And I don't think it will still be necessarily interpreted as a constitutional crisis on the backdrop of the international legitimacy that the Southern Africa development community under the leadership of President Jacob Zuma would front. That's number one. Secondly, the very fact that President Robert Mugabe is now resigned through what he on his own accord said it was not coerced, he was not under any duress, even though we know that he was fined but confined to his home and so on. So really, this is going to be more the politics leading the legal than the constitution leading the politics of the day. All
right, thank you so much, Zimbabwean journalist Nigel Nyatsumutu, for sharing your thoughts on the news at 10. Thanks a lot for that, Nigel, over there in Harare. And back here, home in Nigeria, at least 21 persons are feared dead and 35 others injured following an explosion at a mosque in Mubi, Adamawa State, northeast Nigeria. The Northeast Zonal Coordinator of the National Emergency Management Agency, Bashir Idris, told Channels Television that the blast occurred early this morning while worshippers were holding prayers. Meanwhile, President Muhammadu Buhari has condemned the early morning suicide bomb attack in the mosque in Mubi, describing the act as very cruel and dastardly. While commiserating with families of the victims, the president gave the people of the state the assurance that everything will be done to secure the state against the attacks of Boko Haram insurgents. According to the presidential spokesperson, Garba Shehu, President Buhari has also directed the Inspector General of Police, Ibrahim Idris, to deploy more police personnel to prevent further attacks by armed bandits in Zamfara State. The directive follows the recent killings and destruction inflicted by gunmen on communities in Chinkafe and Mararun local government areas of the state.